I'm Hannah, Virtual Events Manager at DevOps Institute. And before I hand over to our panel, I just have a few tips on using today's platform. On the right of your screen is SKILup Chat. Let's make the session as interactive as possible. Ask our panel any topic questions, use emojis to react to comments, or just let us know where you are in the world. We love our global community. I'll put my email address in the chat in case you have any technical difficulties. So please reach out and I'll help you as best I can. But we do find that refreshing your browser or even going out of the session and coming back in usually fixes most problems. And that can include any sound issues you might be having. If you'd like to view today's session in full screen, there's an icon in the bottom right corner to do that. And today's event will be available on demand from this Sunday, December the 18th, via our SKILup IT learning platform. Further information about accessing this will be emailed to you. Welcome to today's SKILup Hour on CI/CD, sponsored by the amazing Cloudsmith, CloudBees, and Opsera. Your moderator, Mark Halcrow, is Chief Revenue Officer at DevOps Institute. Mark has been engaged in the tech community for over 15 years and has worked to raise market awareness around the business benefits of every aspect of DevOps. So we are in great hands today. Over to you, Mark.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this. Actually, it's amazing. It's our last SKILup Hour for 2022. So thanks for joining. This session, along with past sessions, we're excited for next year's lineup coming soon. So CI/CD today, we're going to be talking about trends, system and organizational design, regulatory compliance requirements, security, and productivity. So with that, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Alan Carson, who is the CEO and founder at Cloudsmith. Alan, welcome. Let me introduce everybody, and then you can introduce yourself. Secondly, I'd like to invite Logan Donnelly. He's the Senior Technical Evangelist at CloudBees. There seems like there's a strong contingency on the line from North Carolina, so you might have brought some people from North Carolina. Logan's in North Carolina himself. And finally, Gilbert Martin, the VP of Customer Experience and Solutions at Opsera. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today for this exciting session. Alan, if I could hand it over to you to introduce yourself. And I don't think you got too much snow in the UK.
Well, there's a bit of ice, but we're not too bad. Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. I'm co-founder and CEO of Cloudsmith, and ultimately Cloudsmith is a software distribution platform that very much sits in the package management space. So we're really concerned about shifting artifacts around the globe, the security, provenance, and ultimately trust of those assets. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Great. Thanks, Alan. And since 2016, Cloudsmith has been around, right?
Yeah, no, we've a long history at this point in the tech business, but yeah.
That's true, right? And yeah. Logan, I guess CloudBees is a bit longer in terms of how the Hive is doing. If you can introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Logan Donnelly. I'm a technical evangelist here at CloudBees. And yeah, we've been around for, I think, 12 years. I've been here for 4 of those, which has been awesome. And so CloudBees is a company really focused in the CI/CD space. We've been branching out recently, having products like a compliance tool, got feature flagging, all that good stuff, but really focused enterprise grade CI/CD for our customers. So excited to have this conversation today.
Great. Thanks, Logan. And Gilbert, I guess you're the new kid on the block with Opsera. So over to you.
Yeah. So I am the new kid on the block with Opsera. We've been around for about 3 years now. Although Opsera is new, I've been around CI/CD for over 10 years. Right. I built teams, ran security, product security. So I have a little bit of experience with the space and love to share what we know. Opsera has been pretty new. We do try to leverage existing investments and automate our pipelines or workflows between tools, gather data and intelligence, and try to create the repeatability. Well, do more with less.
Great. So since you've been in the industry for quite some time, the whole group has been in the industry for quite some time. But if you could highlight some trends that you're seeing in the market now, Gilbert, that'd be great.
Sure. Some of the trends that we're seeing is insights, a lot of insights. A lot of people are shifting to DORA metrics, right? The lead time, the mean time to repair, the deployment frequency. They're shifting, a lot into metrics with the, leveraging their existing investments and tools and really understanding the flexibility there. That's one trend we see. The other trend we see is a lot on security. How do you insert security or accelerate security with the existing tools and create the repeatability and break down the silos between security and developers and DevOps. The other thing in the security space that we see is a movement towards SALSA, which SALSA is, securing your artifacts. I think, Alan, you talked a little bit about provenance and about creating those artifacts, right? So the industry is moving towards that now. It's really across the software supply chain. Very difficult task to do, not very easy. So that's another. And the last trend I'll talk about is DPE. The term DPE is developer productivity engineering, which we see a lot of the DevOps moving into a focus group for increasing the velocity of developer engineering. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Gilbert. Logan, some trends you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, so definitely agree with all those that Gilbert just said. I think adding on to the metrics one, I think that we've really seen over the past, 6 months, a year, it's a pretty new term, value stream management. It's something that's pretty up in the air. Everyone's trying to come up with a new idea for it. But really, it's how do you take the business value and map that to kind of the development processes? And it's a really hard thing to do. And so, we've seen companies starting up. We've seen companies that have been trying to retrograde what they have to fit that. But, it's something that I think over the next few years, we're going to see really starts to become powerful. The next thing, somewhat related, but in general, ML has become just such a powerful thing. I don't know if you all have seen ChatGPT, but just over the past couple of weeks, the amount of
amazing, right? Isn't that insane?
It is wild. And I think it's just, we're going to see more and more ML, whether or not it even fits in the scenario. People just want to see ML everywhere, and we're going to see it. And then, of course, security. We've had lots of big security events in the past few years. It's always been important, but I think it's just really come to the forefront of many people's thoughts, especially with some of the government sort of initiatives that have occurred. So those are kind of the main ones that I see.
Thanks, Logan. And Alan, what are you seeing in the market?
Yeah, I would back all those up as well. I think security, though, I think ultimately that is, very, very important. But I think things are even moving beyond that, to trust. And, so signing has been a big thing recently in terms of, signing of those assets and being able to verify that, the provenance of those assets are pulled through. I think the repeatability side of things is a big deal in terms of making sure that exactly what you're pulling into your infrastructure at any particular point in time. And so, yeah, just, visibility and observability of what's going on is big. And I even think from a historical point of view as well, so that you can actually go back and know, for any 0-day exploit that happened in the past, you can actually go back and tell whether or not you were affected at a particular point in time.
Yeah. Neat. And Alan, with some of your customers, why are they, if you will, looking into these things and making these investments? What are you seeing with your clients?
The major goal for CI/CD software supply chain is to lower risk for organizations. That is the goal of everyone. There are a lot of companies that are still taking very early steps at this stage. We've talked to a few CISOs, and they are still trying to solve the security problem. And it's actually, they only have a limited amount of time that they can ask for a solution out of their engineering teams. So I think, and obviously this is very much sits in sort of the DevOps, DevSecOps thing. I think ultimately it's the responsibility of everyone in the organization, from the developer up to the CTO, to make sure that you're taking the steps, to help. And so, the signing of a package, or the, signing up to an upstream public repository, all of these things, everybody in the organization needs to know what's going on. So it's more about providing that information back, just to give everybody some comfort that you're in a good state.
Neat. And Gilbert, from your side?
Yeah, so I do see, similar to Ellen, security is on top of mind for a lot of people, right? But it's about, how do you break that silo down? We're working with a couple of companies out there that still do kind of what I call traditional technical security reviews, and it takes them months, right? If not, weeks to months on approving those security reviews and really helping understand where to get started, right? I think a lot of people don't know where to get started. So I call it like the lost blueprint. How do you get started? How do you start breaking down these silos? How do you start, understanding the developer and having empathy and sympathy for them to be able to understand, well, what is it that they want to achieve, so that I'm able to help insert security. Like Alan said, everybody is responsible for security. We all want to protect the reputation of the company, and want to make sure the company doesn't get into the news, and making sure that we start shifting left, right, from the beginning, from the time the developer checks out a branch onto their local desktop, right? And then obviously the securing of the supply chain, or the artifact and provenance of how did that software get built. If Gilbert leaves the company tomorrow, how can I reproduce that build without Gilbert being there, right? And that repeatability, we see that a lot. But security is huge, right? I think more so than the other areas. But I think bringing it all together in a platform where you can check the history and everything, and track all of that. So I'll stop there from audit and compliance.
But I have a question. You mentioned that lost blueprint, right? So does that tie in, or two questions? So does that kind of tie into the emergence with value stream management? And my other question is, who owns this lost blueprint, right? Where does it lie?
Yeah, so value stream management, right, is it's just trying to understand where in the process of the software supply chain is the biggest bottlenecks, so you can attack those bottlenecks first, and then be able to, improve the velocity, right? Volume is cool. Like I like to see how many pipelines, and I like to see how many commits, but that really doesn't help me, right? What really helps me is understanding why the commits are big, or how long did a commit sit there before going. So that's value stream management, right? It's understanding the supply chain process and understanding what takes the longest, so you can start looking at that. But then you have challenges like monorepos and microservices, and that can get into a whole different conversation. When I talk about the lost blueprint, I talk about we continue to manually discover vulnerabilities and breaches across our applications and our cloud platforms and our software supply chain. So how do we integrate and automate and build resilient products and applications? So the lost blueprint to me is something that I built in the past at other companies, where I take a step-by-step approach to understanding the audience, really understanding the pipeline and the software supply chain, understanding the hurdles between what I call governing soft and governing hard. And soft is just like, hey, understand empathy, understand like, hey, I'm developer, I'm giving you this recommendation, but I'm not really enforcing it, but I will enforce it in the future. And then governing hard is like, hey guys, I gave you time. Now I'm really gonna enforce this, and I'm really going to put those thresholds in there so it fails the pipeline and creates a pull request and talks back to the developer, right, in that language. So translating compliance and security to the appropriate developer language, so that they're able to measure the software. And then finally, bringing in a programmatic API approach to that platform, right? That VSM platform, or that platform that allows you to build those pipelines in a friendly developer way. So I'll pause there.
Yeah. Thanks, Gilbert. At DevOps Institute, we always say the soft skills are actually the hard skills, right? The human component. Yeah. And Logan, over to you in terms of some customer experiences, success stories that you've been having this past year.
Yeah. I think really quick, I want to touch on that point you just made, Mark, about the human aspect. I think it is so critical. We come into so many customers where they think that this new tool that they buy is going to solve all of their problems, and it's like the tool can help, really increase the rate at which they're doing whatever they're doing. But you really do have to have that human element where you have the right processes and people in place. And so that's where once you have those things in place, the tools really help out. So so I think a really common case with us is orchestration is one of the big things we bring to our customers, where one example I like to go to is this insurance company that I worked with that been around for quite a while. Over the years, they've built up kind of the technical debt that you'd expect. They started with mainframes. They still use mainframes for some of their calculations. They've built up traditional apps, many different traditional monolithic apps for different teams. Recently, they've started using microservices, and all of those technical decisions were kind of the right ones at the right time. But over the years, they've got all this junk that's, it's just, at the end of the day, somehow the customer has their app that they're interfacing with. They don't care what behind the scenes, how it operates. They just need to, get their insurance, sign up for all the stuff, get their, make their requests, all that kind of stuff. They don't care what's behind the scenes. And so what's really important is taking care of all those dependencies that traditionally they didn't really think through, because it was built as it grew and there was no kind of higher level plane that considered all these things. And so that's where we were able to help them, where each of the individual teams had CI tools that had good security testing for their individual pieces of the puzzle. But then we take it a level higher, where we're able to say, hey, this microservice team unfortunately still relies on some of the stuff from this traditional app, but that's not a problem. It's a matter of just connecting the dots there and ensuring that you have visibility into what's going on between the different teams, because when everyone is so siloed, you don't have that sort of situation. And so I think that's just a pretty common trend with our customers, is they've gone from, they're talented engineers. They've built up the things that they've needed over the years, but it's very rare that a company has come in with like the idea of, I like to use the analogy of cities. You have some cities that are grown organically. You go to Atlanta, it's a big mess going around there. It's a great city, but it's, if you try to drive around, it's a real mess. Versus you go to New York City, where everything is all planned out. You can see the grids, much more planning going on there. And many organizations, I think, have that same kind of mindset of, they've started with this really unplanned growth and they need something to kind of tie it together. And that's where implementing the right tools can really help them standardize those processes that, help them connect all the dots.
So with that, you mentioned an insurance company, Logan. So where are things from a regulatory and compliance perspective? You mentioned the insurance. I'm going to start with you on that question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a really important piece, especially, in heavily regulated industries. There's just standards that they need to be upheld to. And, I've talked to customers, I've talked to employees that we have here that have, previously worked at banks and insurance companies. And, everyone knows they need to do testing, but of course, nobody wants to do testing because it's hard and it takes time. And so where CI/CD and orchestration tools can really come into play is, taking those security best practices, ensuring that they're actually followed. I've heard of a story of a bank that went bust because someone, introduced kind of a process where they would just straight up lie about doing the testing and nobody would double check on that. And then it turned out there was some critical bug that, yeah. And so nobody wants that to be their company, where someone was lazy and they skipped a vital step. And so that's where having the right tooling in place. CI started as just, if you think about it from the continuous integration perspective, it's just, how do I merge the code I'm writing into the rest of the code? Let's make sure it still works. But we've evolved so much beyond that to the point where we can do all sorts of testing, from vulnerability scans to speed, performance testing, and all of this, and making sure that we're compliant. And so that's an area that we've really been focused in on, since we work a lot in the public sector. And one of the challenges they've been seeing, and insurance companies as well, is we've got, let's say, a bunch of different tools. We've got Black Duck, we've got Sneak, we've got just like for basically every sort of security testing, they've got the tools in place. But how do we map all that together, and how do we make sure that the right process is followed? And so that's where really you want to have, and that's the beauty of CI/CD tools, is it is really the glue at the end of the day that ties together the whole picture. And so being able to enforce that anytime that you have an application, let's say it's a Spring Boot app, that it needs to follow this particular set of criteria to even go out the door. Like you cannot have the option to skip this sort of security test. So that's where our customers have really been seeing a lot of more effort in the past few years.
Yeah. And Alan posed the same question in terms of CI/CD supporting regulatory compliance.
Yeah, well, I think, obviously I'll take it from an artifact point of view, but ultimately it's about, policy management, of those artifacts, and making sure that you are, you have a set of checks and balances that you can use, and, and automate to make sure that, a package that is, pulled in from an upstream doesn't get put into, get put into production, if it fails one of those checks. And I think what's, interesting about where we've come from and where we've been, I think the biggest issue is probably, developer education, that, it's no longer really okay to just connect directly to a public upstream, because you've got no control of those assets, and whether you use a CI/CD tool to do that, Cloudsmith or one of our competitors, ultimately you want to build an isolation layer away from, software that can be modified by, anybody out there. So I think that's a big deal, and sort of fits into the, the SALSA framework that Gilbert mentioned, earlier. You're getting to start to level 2, level 3 at that point, but which is not easy to get to for many organizations. But I think that's the important thing that developers should take away from this conversation. You should not be connecting to something that you don't have control over. So it's about bringing those assets in, caching them, making sure that the asset that you pull is the one that you expect. The asset that you pull is the one that you have verified. I've spoken to companies where, like, they are going to independently check the source code of updates on dependencies that they're a top 100 cloud company which have resources in order to do that. But that's a lot of work that they are doing, that they're essentially only benefiting them and essentially throwing away. So we don't want to get into that's not sustainable for small businesses. So ultimately, it's just about bringing in those tools and building out that process to make sure that you have ultimately the visibility that you need and the control.
I call that Toil Town. And we need to go from what I call it, from Toil Town to Automation Nation. Yeah. And there's a quick question in the chat while you're on, Alan. So is CI, I can't say it. I need my glasses. And can you guys see the chat? Oh, there's two questions.
CI/CD is, oh, go ahead.
So there's one question. I am transitioning to DevOps and CI/CD. How would you advise on the right learning paths to DevOps and CI/CD?
So I think, looks like you're a freelance web developer. So Yeah, I think you've got a great background to start with. I think going from developer to DevOps is a great path because you can actually understand what getting code into production looks like. But I think the best place to start is fully understanding the types of organizations you want to work at and what that full life cycle of going from code to commit all the way through production is going to look like. If you're doing just freelance web stuff, you might not have got to see the sort of dark underside of many enterprise, workloads. And so I would kind of look at the architecture that way and then see the necessary tools. So I could say, yeah, go play with Jenkins, GitHub Actions, all those things. But, without the context of what you're actually working towards, I think it's not as useful. And so start there. And then you really want to work on kind of the tooling on CI/CD side. So there's many tools. Jenkins is an open source one. You can use GitHub Actions. You can use GitLab. There's all sorts of good tools you can use for free. And then I'd also start learning the cloud providers. Probably start with AWS because everyone, most people use AWS. But they're all fairly similar. There's great resources like A Cloud Guru, and there's a lot of good material out there on just how all of that side of the operation works. But that would be my suggestion of how to start.
Great. Couple other questions coming in. Is CI/CD just normal flow of completing a task, like developing, testing, deploying, so on? Or is it also included my tools to accomplish the CI/CD process?
Well, I mean, it is that, but ultimately it helps with automation and scale. I think, the more things that you throw in terms of complexity, the more automation that you need. So the more developers you have, the more endpoints that you want to deploy to, the more technologies that you have in your stack. Ultimately, you need to start thinking about automation just to make it manageable.
Yeah. Great. Another question, will SAP Solman support GitLab CI/CD, or has it to integrate with Azure DevOps? Any of you? I know I can't answer that question.
No idea.
Yeah, I don't know what SAP Solman is. I'm assuming it's some variation of SAP. I don't think there's a lot of companies out there that support SaaS DevOps applications. Right?
Yeah.
I can talk to it. We support it, but that's another day, another conversation.
Yeah. The same is, if we have time, we could talk about how is DevOps similar or different than SRE. That's a whole other session that we can do on that. You bet. So it's interesting. We spoke about soft skills. We spoke about the CI/CD pipelines. We spoke about teams, about education, about people, and security. And Alan, when we were talking the other day, you mentioned where it starts from your perspective. I thought that was great. So you could share that with everybody. That'd be wonderful.
What did I say the other day?
In terms of trust.
Oh, in terms of trust. Okay.
Security starts with trust.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I mean, that is I think that's the big thing that we are going to see over the next, few years, the next decade, where trust becomes as big an issue to, to building solutions as security has become. And it does sit on top, obviously, but it really is about making sure that you understand where the software comes from, and the provenance of who were the developers that created it, and and its liveliness, and where it originated, and how it has the transitions that it has gone through to get to where you're deploying it. So signing's a big thing around that. So most people will have probably heard of Project SigStore. That's become a really big thing in the last 6 to 9 months. And so it is really leaning into those types of aspects in how you create your artifacts, manage your artifacts, and give you the observability and control of those throughout your pipeline. And I think, from my perspective, I think that's why we're trying to solve these problems with artifact management, because ultimately you're pulling artifacts onto your developer laptop, but you're also deploying them into production. And it starts to get, and I think Gilbert sort of mentioned this sort of earlier, the level of risk that you're willing to take when a developer is developing software is different than what you are when you get to the far end and you're trying to deploy it. So, there are motions that you can go through and processes that you can go through in order to tighten that security and trust up as you go along that, software pipeline. But ultimately, it does start with the developer making smart choices at the beginning of the process. So they need to know about license compliance. They need to know about vulnerabilities within that software. They need to know whether or not that it's a reputable package, and it helps to have all of that information at the beginning, but also at the end, because that's how you ultimately lower risk for your organization, is just by knowing.
And Gilbert, you had mentioned Salsa. So can you share, Salsa is new for me. What can you share where Salsa fits into this?
Yeah, so Salsa is it's what we call the provenance of software supply chain authenticity. So the best analogy to really drive this home is when you buy art, right? When you buy a piece of expensive art, you want to check the authenticity. You want to check the history of that art. Who owned it before you did? Where did it come from? Is it a real authentic piece, or is it a fake one that somebody made it look like it's real? Right? We see a bunch of movies, right, where they steal really expensive art, and then sometimes they get the real one and sometimes they get a fake one, and that's kind of the plot of the story. But it's really the software supply chain authenticity. It's very similar to art, where you want to have different levels of owners check that authenticity and provenance of how you build that software. So establishing trust, right, in that software supply chain, from the time you develop and you do the build to the time you deploy and the time you run, you're running the software, is kind of what Salsa attempts to do. Now, Salsa has different levels. To Alan's point, the source is still not, in my opinion, is still not mature yet. I am part of the OpenSSF, which is driving some of the Salsa standards. And, opens like source code, to get the metadata from the source code. All the APIs are not there yet. The source code providers don't provide those yet. So I think the best place to start when it comes to Salsa is really the build. Start looking at your build, because you have more control over that build, right? So how you build it, use ephemeral builds, meaning don't have static workspaces on a static machine, and use ephemeral builds where it pulls the code every single time, so you don't have code injections at runtime. And then track that build as an artifact. Sigstore is a good one. And then there's a bunch of other open source technologies out there that will track the artifacts and create the provenance of those. So I'll pause there.
And Logan, over to you in terms of the security component, which everybody had mentioned is so important now.
When it comes to security, it really is vital that it's like all these things that Alan and Gilbert have talked about, like that needs to be part of your process. You need to make sure that like it's not just, it's not enough to just say, when you built your code, this is how it is. Like you need to have sort of at the front, as you go through CI process, you want to have those scans. And then you want to make sure that as it gets deployed, you've also got additional sorts of security considerations in those environments. So there's a lot of cool tooling around that now that can actually check, like, you're actually sound. Is it following the best practices? There's tools out there that can scan your your Terraform repo and see, are there any vulnerabilities? Things like that can really help. But just making sure that's part of your process. But the trick is you want to make sure that you don't go so far that it's pushing left. We'll have to use the pushing left terminology all the time in this space, but we don't want to put all that onus directly on the developers because, they've got actual development work to do. You can't just make them also become, in charge of all of security matters. So what's important is the right tooling is in place, ideally by, the security teams and the platform engineers. If the organization is large enough, has those teams, really build out the workflows such that all of this is automatically facilitated on every application they have. And then collecting that, having audit reports so you can see for each version of my software, each deployment, okay, which artifacts are actually deployed? What's the release manifest? What are the tests that have occurred for this? Have there been vulnerabilities in this particular deployment? All of this sort of information so that, in companies that are regulated and are subject to audits, they're able to say, all right, I don't need to spend a month collecting all of this stuff and maybe missing some critical information and, unfortunately getting fined. It's just, hey, here's this document. It has all the information you need. And when that's just part of your process, it just makes life so much easier. Like part of this life, I worked as a consultant and I worked at a big defense contractor, and they had a security team that would, like, their full-time job for every release was to start and collect the data. And that was every day, all day, was just collecting all that evidence. And so that, nobody wants that role. It's a very cumbersome role. And so if you just have the right tools in place, that's just not even a needed thing. It's just, the tools are there as well. It's very possible. Many of our customers do it. It's just, when you have all of that in place, you then feel confident that the software you're pushing out is following all those requirements.
And when it's done manually, I'm preaching to the choir here, but of course the likelihood of human error is much greater,
it's
right?
Very large, yeah.
And I see a question in the chat. Do workload identities relate to CI/CD? Seeing a lot of articles about workload attestation. Anybody want to
I've heard of Spire, right? But Spire seems to be more like an identity framework within the development. So it takes part of that. I'll call it salsa attestation, where it'll look at collecting the metadata for the identity of that piece of software. I haven't seen it or heard of it in the OpenSSF group that I'm a part of, right? To really talk about that, right? When we're in the OpenSSF, which stands for Open Source Linux Foundation, Security for Linux Foundation. It's am I on mute? Can you guys hear me?
No, I can hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I haven't to just answer your question. I haven't really heard of Spire related to CI/CD. I've heard of it through a framework of identity because it's focused on the identity part. But like things for tools for Salsa, there is the InToto, which is a tool that open source out there, and then there is the tool that Alan mentioned earlier, and those are the two tools I know about as of today. But really, you could build your own if you collect metadata, collect all the metadata, create I'll call it a tool registry to be able to collect the metadata and map the assets together. One thing that you'll struggle with, or at least that we've struggled with, is being able to track the public repositories when you fork out a code, right? Because a developer can easily fork out any code from any company and make it public. And sometimes they do it unaware of that, unintentionally, right? So just be careful with that. That's a hard problem to solve. Tracking public I'll call it repositories when a developer does that. And then secrets in code is a huge one, right? In the last 6 months, we've seen at least 3 to 4 or 3 to 6 companies get, hacked because of secrets in code. I'll pause there.
And I think the scary thing is those numbers are just going to increase, right? Which is amazing. Logan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry. Forgot that the mute is a little bit delayed. Yeah, so I hadn't heard of the SPIF spire, things like Googled that, but the workload identities is something that is very relevant in CI/CD. It's something we encounter all the time, which is when you're setting up an agent, for example, and you want to talk to a cloud service, let's say you're wanting to deploy to a Kubernetes cluster. Well, how do you actually do that authentication? It's typically what you do is you'd actually have a physical file via JSON or something that authenticates with your token, but it's not very secure because that token, if it was exposed, I think by default with Google, it's like a 10-year expiration date or something. It's, if that gets out into the wild, anybody could authenticate. And so you really don't want that. And so by using workload identity, you can map, if you're in Kubernetes, the actual pod agent or service count rather, to your IAM service count. And so that means that instead of ever having that token available, it's having the VM that you're running on potentially reach out to the service and authenticate. And so there's no password, no token anywhere. And that really makes everything you do a lot more secure. And just on a brief glance, it looks like those tools help kind of more generically the SPIF tool or framework. But if you have the capacity to do that, definitely take advantage because it makes everything just secure by default.
Right.
More
Thanks,
secure.
Logan. So as we kind of come to a close, I have one last question for y'all. So at the end of the day here, recommendations and thoughts for how to increase productivity, right? So that's something that kind of just as we sum up here, key thoughts, ideas, and how to increase productivity. Alan, over to you.
I think automation. I think you just have to start there. That's building out repeatable processes. That's educating your developers. That's making sure that the software that you're using is secure, because ultimately you can solve the headaches early or you can solve them later, and you don't want to be in a position where you're solving them later, because ultimately that's at a point where you probably have either discovered something, that you've leaked something, that a problem like that. So I think when it comes to productivity, automate everything is sort of a mantra that we have at Cloudsmith, and providing that visibility. Just to go back to the last thing, you can never have enough metadata. Ultimately, put as much security in as you can, capture as much information as you can, because all of that is very useful.
Thanks, Alan. Gilbert, same question over to you.
Yeah. So I believe similar concept to Alan, right? I think with an added of establish a baseline of, think of it like establishing a baseline for all of your tools or all of your software supply chain, that you can start now developing a baseline and getting that visibility. Like I said earlier, volume is great, but then there's so many tools out there. There's Jenkins, there's Microsoft confusing the world with Azure DevOps and GHA, GitHub Actions. And, we are a partner with GitHub. And one of the things that the way they described this is just kind of a little bit off topic here, is they describe GHA, which is GitHub Actions, as their electric car, and Azure DevOps as their gas car, which is, if you follow the news, it's supposed to be, the gas car is supposed to be, expiring in 2025 or something like that, right? But I think from a developer productivity specifically is really understand the bottlenecks, the pain points. So the Netflix of the world, the LinkedIn's of the world, the the Facebooks of the world or Meta of the world, they have all these resources and they create these DPE teams specifically for focusing on, let's say, even a pull request check-in, right? Or even doing unit tests or tests of the software where developers don't even think about. They just commit code and they don't really think about even deploying the code because they have groups that are focused on that. Now, everybody else in the world that is not those have difficulties and challenges on getting to that level. So I guess my suggestion would be, how do you help establish a baseline to understand where those bottlenecks is, which is part of VSM, but I like to take it even further in the velocity. VSM is just a place where you understand. How do you now take that understanding and really like optimize in that specific area to increase and not context switch, right? Developers like to develop features. They like to, that's what they get paid for. That's what they do. As soon as you context switch for a developer, they are like, okay, I'm gonna like wait for this build to finish. I'm gonna be back in an hour, and it's gonna now what I'm gonna I'm just context switching. So context switching, reducing the context switching of a developer is where they'll start focusing, and that's where I feel, hey, we should help them do that. How do we help them do that? It depends on every organization.
Yeah. Thanks, Gilbert. Logan, over to you.
Let me make sure. There we go. Yeah. So, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
My headphones disconnected for a second. Yeah. So, I agree with everything you just said there, and I think a real nice thing is when you can standardize. You don't need to standardize on everything, but I think really the worst thing is when you go to an organization where every different team has their own tech stack that's totally different, and what that ends up causing is every time you're going to spin up a new service, you go through the headache of, okay, well, I can do anything I want. And so I'm going to use the tool that I think is perfect for this use case. Okay, I'm going to use Rust because I know Rust is super fast. Well, we don't have an existing pipeline for that. So now I need to go build one out. And okay, what tools do I need to, for security scanning for this? And all of these different things that it's like you don't really want to have to think about as you're scaffolding out a new application. And so the more you can have a standardized pipeline that is just kind of your gold standard, I think really helps. Because that helps both from the bottleneck finding side and also from developers being able to spin up everything, in an instant. And so having there's lots of tools out there for like self-service now, where like Backstage, things like that, where you can now scaffold out a new service where your organization says, okay, we only do Spring Boot apps, we're going to do Node.js apps. If you choose one of those two, then it's going to instantly have the right editor configuration. It's going to have the right, repo organization. It's going to have the right CI pipelines, all of this, which at the end of the day means that as a developer, I could switch teams, I can contribute to their code, I can do anything like that. And there's no need for me to switch context all that much because everything looks the same. And so the more you can kind of instill that in your organization, the more productive people can be, on top of what Alan and Gilbert have said in terms of just making sure everything is automated, attack those bottlenecks, all of that, really understanding where you are and speed up all the areas that you can. But I think as much as you can standardize really, really helps out.
Yeah. Thanks, Logan. Oh my goodness. So there's a new question in the chat. I have no clue how many times over the course of the past 2 months, 3 months, that I've heard platform engineering, right? It's just amazing, at least from my side. So I don't know about you all, but it's like I think Gartner came out with a report in October, and now everybody's talking about platform engineering. So we have one last question, and what is it? It's the difference between DevOps and platform engineering. Who wants?
Yes, I can take a stab at it. I'll take a stab. So when I used to work at Citrix, we actually built what we called a platform engineering team, and we set out to go build a platform. And the platform is the ability to consume a service through a programmatic way, or an ability to provide, I'll call it the whole software supply chain to somebody to consume, right? Without them having to build anything. So the, and DevOps is, I'll call it a team that, again, maintains or manages a set of software supply chain tools, such as like Jenkins, Argo CD, anything in between, and also provides insights. But I mean, a platform engineering could be, okay, so I'll pause there. So DevOps is a group of people managing a set of tools. Platform engineering is a platform that offers those as a service to engineers, right? Or at least that's the attempt to do it. And it's really difficult. It's not easy because there's so many, I'll call it, there's so many things that go into a platform. Everything from like managing secrets to integration of tools to integration of tools talking to each other in a secure way, what I call app-to-app communication or user-to-app communication. Collecting the metadata, and then finally giving you the insights to understand your how your builds are doing, which is what value stream management is, like, well, where are my bottlenecks, and then help increase velocity. But it's not just that. It's what Amazon did for, I'll call it, infrastructure, right? They created a platform where you're able to, as a developer, programmatically, call a system to be able to get a small workload, right, in minutes versus like hours or weeks or day or months. So that's my definition. But we can have a longer conversation offline.
Right. It's like the DevOps and SRE conversation, right? Yeah.
We can have another conversation on that as well.
Yeah. Neat. Alan, Logan, do you want to chime in?
No, I mean, that was a great answer. I suppose it just goes back to that DevOps is a methodology as well. It's not just specific to, teams and tools, and it's really about, managing feedback loops within your organization, just to take those bottlenecks out. But yeah, no, Gilbert that was a good answer.
Yeah.
I think one thing I would add is just when you're looking at an organization, like, read what the actual roles are for that team, not the actual name, because I've worked with so many companies that DevOps means something completely different from the next. And at the end of the day, I think Gilbert's explanation of what the ideal form would be was really good. But yeah, definitely look at those roles and responsibilities.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, Logan. I was talking to a large recruiting company last year, and they said that their team hates hiring for DevOps roles because it's like if I ask each of you, which I'm not going to, what your definition of a DevOps engineer is, we'll get 4 or 5 different answers, right? So definitely true. A great recommendation in terms of actually reading the description rather than the job title. Yeah. Great. Any final thoughts? I'm sorry, go ahead, Gilbert.
Yeah, I saw somebody ask about how to become what courses to take or what path to take. As a developer, if you're a developer, which I think you're a web front-end developer, that's my assumption, is you already have a path. So, understanding that branching strategy and understanding, that you already have kind of the foundations of the language, and then be able to programmatically provide a service to somebody to be able to deploy. I'm not trying to answer your question, Mark, at all, because that'll go to another conversation. But yeah, I mean, in general, guys, I mean, if you're able to help improve either security or the velocity of software, that really will help you in your career. It'll help you in the company, and it'll create a win-win situation for everybody. And I think that's the best thing I can do. And fail. Don't be scared to fail. Fail fast, and that, because you'll learn, and as long as you continue to learn, I call them experiences. I call failures experiences, because that's what makes us human, right? It makes us like, hey, we experienced it. We hope we don't do it again, and we move forward, right? And that's all. I'm gonna end with that.
Great. Thanks, Gilbert. From a learning perspective, also, I invite everybody to check out SKILup IT Learning on the DevOps Institute website. It's our online learning platform that we recently launched. You can learn more about CI/CD, SRE, a whole bunch of topics. So I invite you to check that out. On that note, everybody, thanks so much for joining. A special thanks to Alan, Gilbert, and Logan. Really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. Really appreciate it. So until next year, everybody, Mark Halker here. Thanks so much, and have a great new year. Appreciate it.
Thanks, gents.